You ever get so fed up with someone bossing you around that you just have to flip the script on them? That's exactly what happened to me when my HOA president, let's just call her Lindy, decided to make my life miserable over something as simple as the color of my house. Now, I'm not one to stir up trouble. I mind my own business, keep my yard clean, pay my dues, and stay out of neighborhood drama. But Linda, she lived for drama. She treated the HOA like her personal throne, and every homeowner in our neighborhood had felt her wrath at some point. Whether it was nitpicking about mailbox height, complaining about the color of flower pots, or demanding that people trim bushes to her liking, Linda made sure everyone knew who was in charge. My run-in with her started when I decided to repaint. My house, the original color, had faded, and I thought it was time for a fresh coat. I picked a warm slate blue shade, nothing flashy, just something that looked fresh and calming. Within 2 days of the painter starting, I got a letter taped to my door. Not mail taped. The kind of move, you know, was personal. It read, according to HOA policy, all house colors must be neutral tones: beige, cream, light gray, or white. Your color choice violates HOA standards. You have 2 weeks to repaint or face fines. Now, here's the kicker. There is no such neutral tones only rule in the HOA handbook. I had read it cover to cover before hiring the painters. What Linda had done was enforce her personal preference as if it were law. I went to the next HOA meeting with the handbook in my hand. I stood up and asked her, point blank, Linda, can you show me where in this handbook it says my house can't be painted blue? She shuffled through her papers, mumbled something about neighborhood aesthetics, but couldn't point to a single page. Still, she said, we reserve the right to determine what fits the character of the neighborhood, and your blue house does not. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Linda wanted a neighborhood of beige boxes, and my blue house stood out. I walked away from that meeting angry, but instead of giving in, I got an idea. See, Linda drove a shiny beige Lexus that she loved showing off, always polished, always parked perfectly in front of her house. And every time she talked about neutrals, she was basically describing the same color as that car. So, I thought, if she wants beige, she's going to get beige, but on my terms. I went back to the paint store, took a high-resolution picture of Linda's Lexus, and asked the store to color match it. When they mixed the paint, it was perfect down to the glossy finish. I hired the painters again and told them to repaint the house in the exact shade of Linda's car. You should have seen her face when she drove home and saw my freshly painted house. Her mouth fell open, her eyes went wide, and she stopped her Lexus right in front of my driveway, just staring. My house and her car looked like twins. The next day, another letter appeared on my door. This time it said, your house color is inappropriate and mocking. You must repaint immediately. I laughed so hard I nearly cried. She couldn't argue it wasn't beige. She couldn't claim it didn't fit her neutral obsession. She had no grounds. When I brought the letter to the next HOA meeting, people were fed up. Homeowners had been quiet before, but now they were whispering, chuckling, and finally, speaking up. One neighbor stood up and said, Linda, if his house matches your car, then by your logic, it should be the perfect fit for the neighborhood. Another added, if we all paint our houses like his, would that make you happy? The room erupted in laughter, and for once, Linda had no comeback. Over the next few weeks, my house became a bit of a local attraction. People driving through. The neighborhood slowed down just to get a look at it. Neighbors would point and laugh, telling visitors the story of how I turned Linda's demand into a joke. Even kids riding their bikes would yell, "Nice Lexus house," as they pedaled by. And here's where the twist came in. Linda, embarrassed by all the attention, tried to push through an emergency amendment to the HOA rules that banned car-colored paint. Yes, you heard me right. She tried to write into the bylaws that no house could match the color of an automobile. But that was her downfall. People had tolerated her petty rules before, but this was too much. The homeowners banded together, voted her out as HOA president, and rewrote the rules so that homeowners actually had freedom of choice within reason over their house colors. My house, the beige Lexus house, stayed exactly the way it was. And Linda, she stopped attending meetings altogether. Rumor has it she even started parking her Lexus in her garage instead of out front because she couldn't stand the reminder. That was the day I learned something important. Sometimes, the best way to beat controlling people is to play their game better than they do. Linda wanted beige, and I gave her beige butt in a way she'd never forget. And to this day, every time I pull into my driveway, I smile. Because my house isn't just beige, it's justice painted across every wall. When I finally revealed my freshly painted house to the neighborhood, it was like throwing a grenade into the calm, beige-coated world of our HOA. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors stopped their cars mid-drive. Dog walkers slowed down in disbelief. And the gossip chain caught fire faster than I could have imagined. I had chosen the exact shade of beige that matched the HOA president. Karen's shiny luxury SUV, not just any beige, her beige. The polished, showroom, perfect, metallic tone that she adored, parading it around like it was the crown jewel of the neighborhood. Now, instead of her car standing out, it blended right into my entire house. By evening, Karen was at my door. She stood there in a blazer, clipboard in hand, lips tight like she was chewing on a lemon. "Do you think this is funny?" she snapped. Before I even said hello, I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Funny? No. Fitting. Absolutely. You said beige, Karen, and I listened. Her nostrils flared. That is not the approved shade. You know exactly what you did. I pointed casually toward her SUV parked across the street. Well, it's the exact same shade as your car. You must have really good taste if you chose it for your vehicle. I figured it would be HOA approved. The smirk on my face only made her angrier. She jabbed at her clipboard with her pen. You're mocking the rules. That's grounds for a fine. Oh, I'm not mocking anything, I said smoothly. I'm embracing the HOA standards. Beige is beige, right? Karen stormed off, heels clicking so loudly, I swear they echoed down the street. By the next morning, I had received my first fine notice in the mailbox. A violation letter that claimed my house color was unapproved despite her own car, sitting in her driveway in the exact same shade. But here's the thinker and underestimated me. I wasn't going to be another homeowner who rolled over when the HOA barked. No, I started doing my homework. I dug into the HOA's bylaws, flipping page after page until I found a goldmine of contradictions. The rule stated houses must be painted in neutral earth tone colors. Beige was specifically listed as acceptable. But what wasn't clear was the exact shade. There was no chart, no standardized palette, nothing. Just vague wording. That's when it hit. Karen had been relying on ambiguity. She used the vague rules as a weapon to control people. And I had just exposed the flaw. I made copies of the bylaws, highlighted the inconsistencies, and started slipping them under my neighbors' doors. Some had been fined for their gardens, others for mailbox designs, and a few even for the length of their grass. Everyone had a story, and now, with evidence in hand, they were starting to see Karen for what she really was, a power-hungry dictator hiding behind a clipboard. Within a week, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen's authority was cracking, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she made a desperate move to silence me. But what I didn't expect was how far she would go. The day after the community meeting, whispers began circulating in the neighborhood. Word of my beige car-colored house spread faster than wildfire. Some neighbors snickered when they drove by. Others looked horrified. Kids on bikes slowed down, just to laugh, pointing at the uncanny resemblance between my siding and the HOA president's shiny beige SUV parked in her driveway, Karen. On the other hand, was absolutely fuming. I knew it because she didn't waste a single day before storming. Up to my porch again, her heels clicked so sharply against the concrete walkway, it was like an approaching warning bell. She didn't knock, she pounded. "Open the door right now," she shouted. I swung it open calmly, sipping coffee like I was expecting a guest. "Morning, Karen. Beautiful weather, isn't it?" Perfect for beige cars and beige houses. Her face flushed red, and I swear I thought steam might come out of her ears. "You think this is funny? Do you have any idea what kind of mockery you've made of this neighborhood?" I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "I'm sorry. Are you saying my house isn't beige enough? Because I spent a lot of money making?" Sure, it matched yours. The neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk snorted with laughter. A couple even pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. Karen noticed and turned her back to them, hissing at me in a lowered voice. "You've humiliated me," she spat. "This is harassment, plain and simple. The HOA won't stand for it." "Funny," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Because I read the bylaws. They state houses can only be painted in approved neutral tones. Beige, gray, cream, taupe. Sound familiar? And mine fits perfectly. If anything, I'm a shining example of compliance." That night, I received the first of many violation letters in my mailbox. They were ridiculous claims that my lawn wasn't trimmed evenly, that my trash cans were 2 inches too close to the curb, that my mailbox was fading. It was clear Karen was launching a personal vendetta. But what she didn't realize was that I was documenting everything. Every letter, every petty claim, every time she confronted me in public while the neighbors filmed. My folder of evidence was getting thicker by the week. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening. Neighbors who once feared Karen started quietly supporting me. They'd stop me on walks, pat me on the back, and say things like, "Finally, someone's standing up to her," or "About time someone called her out." Some even confessed that she'd bullied them into repainting their houses or paying pointless fines. The more Karen tried to make me the villain, the more the neighborhood rallied behind me. And the best part? The beige house and beige car became a running neighborhood joke. Someone even printed t-shirts that said Team Beige. Karen's control was slipping, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she escalated. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to propose a brand new rule that banned houses from matching the color of a vehicle. I raised my hand before she could finish. "Quick question," I said loudly. "Wouldn't that mean you'd have to repaint your own house, since your siding is the same shade as your car?" The room erupted in laughter. Karen's face went pale, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. But I knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't the kind of person to let things go. And I wasn't done proving a point. Because if she wanted war, I was prepared to win it in the most creative way possible. You know, when I thought I had already pushed the limits of patience with my HOA president, Linda, I truly believed that painting my house the exact color of her shiny beige luxury car was the peak of rebellion. But life, as it often does, had other plans. What I didn't realize back then was that this petty war of colors was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would draw in neighbors, lawyers, and even city officials. After the paint dried and the HOA board gathered their fury, I began to notice subtle changes around the neighborhood. Neighbors who once smiled politely started slowing their cars in front of my driveway, whispering with their passengers while pointing toward my freshly painted house. Some were entertained, others visibly annoyed. But the oddest thing was how Many of them seemed to silently root for me, like my little act of defiance was their own quiet victory against the HOA's suffocating grip. The morning after the board officially delivered their final warning letter, I found Linda herself, pacing at the end of my lawn. She was wearing her usual wide-brimmed hat, clutching a clipboard, scribbling something as she squinted at my house like she was measuring each shade of beige against her beloved car parked a few yards away. "Morning, Linda," I called, sipping my coffee on the porch. She didn't answer. She just shook her head slowly, muttering something about property values and blatant disrespect. But here's the thing. I wasn't backing down by then. I had already talked to a local lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. His advice was clear. If your house color complies with the city's residential code and doesn't violate safety regulations, the HOA has little ground. But, he paused, smirking, if you want to play their game, make sure you play. It's smarter than they do. That was all I needed to hear. From that day forward, I kept meticulous notes of every interaction. Every letter Linda slipped into my mailbox. Every time she stopped in front of my house for inspection. Every HOA meeting where she mentioned me by name as the example of what happens when a resident disregards community rules. And that's when something unexpected happened at the next HOA meeting. Instead of hiding in the shadows like I usually did, I walked in, sat at the front row, and waited for my turn to speak. The room fell silent. You could practically hear Linda's pen drop. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing tall. "You've all heard Linda say I disrespected the HOA. But let me ask you something. How many of you have received fines or warnings for things as trivial as leaving your trash cans out an hour too long, or for planting flowers not on the approved list? How many of you have felt that the rules were more about control than community?" Hands started going up. Slowly at first, but then more confidently. Heads nodded. People murmured agreements. And in that moment, I realized something profound. This wasn't just my fight anymore. This was every frustrated homeowner's fight. Linda tried to shut me down. Of course. She banged her gavel, raising her voice. "This is not the proper forum for complaints. You are violating the agenda." But the people had already heard me. And once that door was open, it couldn't be closed again. After the meeting, 3 neighbors came to my house to thank me. One of them, Mr. Harris, an elderly man with a cane, admitted he'd been fined twice last year because his grandson parked a pickup truck in his driveway. Vehicle Linda claimed was unsightly. Another neighbor confessed she'd been written up for hanging a wind chime on her porch. A wind chime. Suddenly, my beige rebellion became a rallying cry. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I worked long hours, but every evening I'd find someone new on my porch, eager to share their own horror story about HOA harassment. And the more I listened, the more I realized Linda wasn't just a stickler for the rules. She was running the HOA like her own little kingdom. So, I did what anyone in my shoes would do. I dug deeper. Public records, city ordinances, old HOA documents buried in dusty filing cabinets. And what I found made my jaw drop. Linda had been enforcing rules that weren't even properly voted in. Entire amendments she waved around as law had never been legally adopted. She was fining people on authority she didn't technically have. And right there, buried in the paperwork, was my golden ticket. A clause in the HOA bylaws that said if 67% of homeowners signed a petition, they could hold a special vote to recall the HOA board. The night I shared this with my neighbors, the mood shifted from frustration to determination. People started showing up at my house with clipboards. We divided streets, knocking on doors, talking to families who had long suffered in silence. Some were hesitant, scared of retaliation. But when I told them about the illegal fines, when I showed them the documents proving Linda's overreach, They signed. It was slow at first, but momentum is a funny thing. It builds. It snowballs. Soon, even neighbors I barely knew were dropping by with signed forms. And every time Linda stormed around, wagging her finger at me or handing out another notice of violation, more people joined our side. By the time spring rolled around, we had more than enough signatures. And Linda, she didn't see it coming. The night of the special vote, the community hall was packed. People who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up, buzzing with energy. Linda sat at the front, her face tight, lips pursed like she'd just bitten into a lemon. She was ready to wield her gavel and put us back in our place. But when the ballots were counted, the results were undeniable. She was out. The board was dissolved, and the look on her face when she realized the community had turned against her was worth every ounce of paint I had bought. But let me tell you something, that wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Because once the board was dissolved, people started asking a bigger question. Do we even need an HOA at all? And the answer, my friends, was about to change the entire neighborhood forever. I wish I could say that after the neighborhood meeting, things calmed down, but that would be far from the truth. If anything, Karen doubled down on her obsession. She seemed more determined than ever to make my life miserable, and painting my house the exact color of her car had only fueled her vendetta. For the next few weeks, Karen went out of her way to patrol the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, jotting down any supposed violations. My trash bins being at the curb 5 minutes early. Written up, my grass looking slightly uneven after mowing. Written up, even my kid's basketball hoop, which had been in the driveway for years without a single complaint, suddenly became a safety hazard. It was harassment, plain and simple. And the other neighbors started noticing it too. One afternoon, as I was taking out the garbage, my neighbor Tom, who had mostly kept to himself during this feud, walked over and shook his head. She's losing it, man. Nobody likes her anymore. Honestly, we're all just waiting for someone to stand up to her. I smiled. That's the plan. Because while Karen thought she had me backed into a corner, I'd been preparing something big behind the scenes. See, when she first started this beige nonsense, I went through the HOA bylaws carefully. And I discovered something interesting. The HOA rules allowed for amendments, but only if enough homeowners voted for them. And lately, with how much Karen had been terrorizing everyone, people were starting to side against her. So I drafted a proposal, a new amendment that would limit the president's power, requiring board approval for all enforcement actions. Number: more one-person crusades, no more dictatorship. If Karen wanted to enforce something, she'd have to convince others on the board, and considering how many people she had alienated, that wasn't likely to happen. I started going door to door, collecting support, and the responses were better than I expected. People were tired of the constant harassment, the ridiculous fines, and the way Karen treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. One by one, neighbors signed on. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I had enough votes to force the issue. The room was packed that night, with more homeowners showing up than I'd ever seen before. Karen strutted in, still convinced she was in control, and launched into her usual lecture about community standards and protecting property values. But when it was my turn to speak, I stood up and presented the amendment. I explained how it would bring fairness back to the HOA, how it would protect homeowners from being singled out, and how it would ensure the board worked together rather than bowing to one person's ego. Karen's face turned red. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You're all being manipulated." He painted his house to mock me, and now he's trying to take away the HOA's authority. But then something unexpected happened. My neighbors spoke up. One by one, they started sharing their own stories. A family that had been fined for having holiday decorations up too long. A retired couple who had been written up for parking at an angle in their own driveway. Even Tom, the quiet neighbor, stood and said, "We've had enough. This isn't a community anymore, it's a prison. And we all know who's responsible." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Karen. When the votes were counted, the amendment passed by a landslide. From that moment on, Karen's reign was effectively over. She could no longer hand out fines or enforce rules without full board approval. And considering how unpopular she'd become, the board wasn't exactly eager to back her. The best part? She still had to drive her car past my house every single day, knowing full well that its exact color was splashed across my siding for the world to see. A few weeks later, Karen resigned as HOA president. Officially, she said it was for personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth: she'd lost the power she craved. And without it, she had no reason to stick around. As for me, my house is still painted the same color as her car. I could repaint it now if I wanted to, but honestly, I don't. Because every time I look at it, I'm reminded of the time I stood my ground, turned Karen's own vanity against her, and helped free an entire neighborhood from her control. And sometimes, late at night, I'll see neighbors walking past, pointing at my house and laughing. Not in a mocking way, but in a relieved, grateful way. Like the house itself had become a symbol of standing up against ridiculous authority. I never set out to be a hero. I just wanted to live in peace. But sometimes, the only way to find peace is to fight back and maybe get a little creative in the process. So, to anyone dealing with their own HOA Karen, right now remember this: they might have rules, they might have power, but they don't have your spirit. And if you stand your ground, you might just change more than your own life, you might change your entire community. And that's the story of how my house ended up painted the exact same color as the HOA president's car. What started as a petty demand turned into a neighborhood-wide revolt, and in the end, wasn't just about paint, it was about standing up to control, pettiness, and unfair power. Sometimes, all it takes is one bold move to turn the tide.